So, good evening, everybody. Here we are again on World War II TV for a show I have been looking forward to for, well, since I announced it, really. We're going to talk about the Renaissance man that is Spike Milligan. And I have four incredible guests joining me this evening. So I'll start with my mate Colin first, because it was Colin's idea to have this show over a whiskey. When we were allowed to go out, we were around my house, we were drinking a few whiskeys, and we came up with the idea of doing a Spike Milligan show. So thank you for the idea, Colin, and welcome to the show. After Colin, Peter Caddick Adams, you've known him. He's done a couple of shows with us, Gold Beach, what have you, military historian, best-selling author, former soldier. Thank you very much for joining us, Peter. Good evening.
Lovely to be here.
Comedian Stewart Lee, comedian, broadcaster, author, journalist, you name it, written an opera, blah, blah, blah. Stuart Lee, thank you very much for joining us.
All right, thank you.
And of course, we can't, last but not least, we have one of Spike's children, the lovely Jane Milligan, who's going to be giving the family perspective. So good evening, Jane. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hello.
So there's someone, I've got an audio. I can hear my voice coming back from someone's screen. I don't know who it is. Doesn't really matter.
It's probably me.
Last but not least, we have one of Spike's children, the lovely Jane. Yeah, that's my voice I can hear in the background.
Right. I don't know. What do I do to that then?
I don't know.
It's gone.
It's gone. Okay, we're good then. So we'll start the ball rolling. For those watching, of course, we know Spike Milligan wrote 7 incredible books about World War II, plus loads of books about poetry and comedy and Robin Hood and what have you. But I'm going to start with Peter about the military aspect. We've got, Peter, some classic books from World War II in regards to first-person accounts. We have Sidney Jarry's 18 Platoon, Quartered Safe Out Here by George MacDonald Fraser. As a military historian, where do you think Spike's books sit in that field? And do we take them with enough seriousness in terms of what they tell us about the battles? Peter?
I read Spike's books when they first came out, and I read them for the humour, and I've reread them several times since from a historical point of view, and they stack up incredibly well as military history. So when I was writing my book about the Battle of Monte Cassino, I quoted or cited Spike's wounding and that particular part of his war. So I think if we're looking at this objectively in a military sense, he has a very valid voice, and it's important to listen to it. But I think also in the whole, Spike Milligan comes from the humour of soldiers, and anyone who served a long way from home, whether in war or peace, soldiers together produce incredible humour. It's black humour because you are dealing with difficult things staring you in the face. And even in Bosnia, which wasn't a shooting war, you were presented with the results of a shooting war that I saw in the mid-90s. And there were plenty of Spike-like characters, none as clever with their humour as him, but a lot who were very amusing. And that's, I think, what touches a chord with many who were national servicemen who served in the Second World War. They recognise that because put a bunch of men together in a really difficult situation, or men and women, and you get the most incredible, counterintuitive humour. And that's what he gives us. And I think one of the problems is when you come home, you can't communicate what you've been through to the civilian world back, in this case, in Blighty. The bridge between military service in a difficult place far away and home life, even the home front in the war, is just wide. And what I think Spike's writing did was bridge that gap with his humour. And that's why his memoirs work, because you've got real diary entries, his own personal feelings, you've got his photographs, and then you've got these absurd Hitlergrams, Hitler issuing orders, Rommel, Mussolini talking about amongst themselves, and you've got the Spike humour that we all know and love. And that actually is not just him. That's what soldiers do. They banter. And that's why every aspect of the diary is very real and very valid, because that's exactly how people are, that's how soldiers are. And I think Spike Milligan's genius is not just his wit, but his ability to identify what military life is like and bottle it and put it in his books. And that's what those wonderful war memoirs are. And of course, he says it was a trilogy. I think volume 4, which is when I think he gets to Italy, he starts to label as a massively mislabeled trilogy, because of course he's gone on beyond the first 3 books. But it just shows you how amusing they are. And I think, therefore, that, you know, there's a very real contribution that he makes. This is valid Second World War history in all its glory, with all its humour, and the darker side as well. And we get it all served up to us on a plate in the best of possible ways. So I'm a #1 fan. I really am.
Well, I think we're all going to compete for that title tonight. But I mean, Stewart, the other thing, I'll bring Janie in and say, Stewart, clearly Spike speaks to the military, the veteran, but he also spoke to people who hadn't seen any combat at all. When we were exchanging emails, you know, you were saying that Spike's writing kind of helped you understand a little bit about your grandfather experience. So clearly he was able to communicate war to people who hadn't any idea what war is as well, makes him a little bit different.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I lived with my grandparents, and they were obviously of that generation that had been in the war. My granddad was a ground crew in the RAF, and all his stories about war were 90% of them were the sort of stories that are in Spike's books, that were about people hanging around, wondering what was for breakfast, passing the time, getting in sort of little scrapes and anecdotes, and about the humour of camaraderie. Interspersed with 1 or 2 life-changingly traumatic events. And most of your experience of war fiction were adventure stories or were about action. But Spike's books seem to reflect the stories that I was told and the experience that the people I knew had, in as much of a lot of it was about constructing imaginative ways of coping with the boredom and the monotony and the uncertainty, and then having to deal with things that were really shocking and changed your life. So they seemed instantly more honest to me than any other sorts of war stories I came across. And we all read them as teenagers at school, and we were all fans of the humour as well, which obviously helped. But really, I just think they seemed honest and true in a way that most stuff doesn't. Also, I mean, when you probably the most famous war literature for someone like me is the First World War poetry, but most of that is by officer class type people, and it's about the sort of nobility of the struggle, whereas Spike's view is much more that of the common man, and it's about the absurdity of it. And when there's a great bit, I think, in the second book where he's talks about being in a little trench that he's had to dig himself, and he has to spend a quarter of each night looking in a different direction, and he thinks of hundreds of thousands of men all over the world at that point standing in similar little holes on different sides, looking in different directions and wondering what it was all for. And that communicates as much, I think, as Dolce et Decorum-esque or a Wilfred Owen poem, but it comes from a completely different angle.
Which would be your point, wouldn't it, Colin? We had this discussion on our poetry show about World War I poetry being, as Stewart said, written by the toffs mostly, whereas Spike spoke from just the ordinary people, and frankly, the people who didn't want to be there. You know, the people who just were conscripted. You know, the famous Ohms letter that comes through the door. So, as a working class lad yourself, Colin, I mean, Spike speaks to you more than perhaps your Wilfred Owen. Is that fair to say?
I would say it is, because as I said in that show, Paul, everybody talks about the killing fields of Eton, the playing fields of Eton to the killing fields of France. Nobody talks about from the shipyards of Sunderland to the killing fields of France. And it is from that tranche of society where most of the loss of life is in the First War and also in the Second War. And I think that's what I love about the language of Milligan, is the way he puts that across. But I also think what's an important point with Spike, yes, we get lots and lots of humour from Spike, and it is absolutely wonderfully written. And my grandfather would confirm what Stewart said about his grandfather. But there's a payoff to the belly laughs in the early volumes. such as when the lieutenant is killed, but you don't get a description of the death of the lieutenant. You get the humorous moment which makes you laugh out loud, and then the payoff at the end of the paragraph is he would be dead in 8 days. And that is, for me, epitomizes why these works by Spike Milligan in World War II are so important that people keep reading them. They don't have the dryness of a battalion war diary or a regimental diary. This is not about the big picture of the African-Italian campaigns. This is one man's war and how it affected him personally and those immediately around him. That's why it's a really important part of the literature of World War II.
Sorry, yeah, Stewart.
I mean, Jane, when did he talk to you about his war experiences, and if so, was it in the vein of the books?
I don't think he ever really specifically sat me down and talked to me about the war. It was him. He was very shaped by the war. So the way he lived his life was because of his experiences with the war. Plus, he'd obviously made a living after the war, out of the war. So, of course, it was in our family home, in our psyche, and these books were being written as I was growing up. But I can't say he ever really sat me down and told me a tale of something that happened. Obviously, the poetry, he would often share the poetry if he'd created something. And as we all know, some of his poetry was very emotionally, very upsetting, Long Stop Hill, where he lost, I think it was his sergeant major or corporal. Or I must admit, obviously, I'm not as knowledgeable about the war as you, and I grew up with this man who wrote these incredible books, but I was privy to his heartbreak and what it did to him and the effect it had on him, and it was with him for his whole life. As I said, it shaped him and was who he was. He called himself a soldier probably till the end. And a lot of people would imagine Spike was a chaotic man, and that his home would be as mad as he appeared. But in fact, being a soldier, he was a very ordered human being, and his home and his life and the way he lived was reflected in every day.
That's really interesting. And I mean, do we know, Jane, exactly how he went about the writing process? Did he do the military work first? Did he write did it just kind of pour out in a stream of unconsciousness? Do you have any idea how the process was?
He was a real archivist naturally. He was not educated in a university. He was self-educated, and that comes through in the books, which is again why it's so down to earth and human and not in any way sort of pompous. One thing he did come with was a great imagination and a great sense of humor. So he had a skill with words, didn't he? So he was a clever writer. He had a gift. That alongside, he wrote a diary for the whole of his time in the war, and he kept those notes and those diaries very close to him for his whole life. So he also did a lot of illustrations during the war. And so he came out of the war with a lot of material to refer to write these books. And yes, I'm sure he did go, he did go to probably, he did check his sources and his facts and all that, but most of it came from him, from his day-to-day experience in the war and the notes that he made throughout the war.
I mean, at the start of Mussolini, my part in his part in my downfall, he quotes Clive James saying that he enjoyed Spike Milligan's unreliable history of the war, and then your father's very adamant about how he worked from his diaries. He says he spent lots of money on beers and meals, interviewing all the people that he served with.
Yes,
the diary entries are in there. There are letters in there. There are bits of his superiors' diaries and letters, and some of the bits that I thought were made up for comic effect, like about your grandfather saying that he wrote to someone he wrote a really mad letter to someone trying to get Spike a position in the RAF, and it was so funny. I just assumed that he'd made it up, and then the actual letters in there. So some of the things you think are jokes are then or have been exaggerated for comic effect. then turn out, when the research is shown to you in the book, to be completely verbatim what happened. And obviously the descriptions are heightened, but it does seem as if it's pretty much all as it took place.
Yeah, he was detailed in his findings. You know, he was a real stickler for keeping notes, keep every bit of paper. I mean, his filing system was ridiculously thorough. You know,
there's a couple of lads on Twitter who are studying the 38th Irish Brigade in Italy, and they say that Spike's maps are as good as the maps that came out of the war diaries and the archives they're researching. So and Peter could probably back up me up on that. You know, the map, the details are there. There's no he says he exaggerates his own history, but the recollections of the military engagements, I mean, Peter, they're pretty good, aren't they?
They are. I mean, I've been to Monte Cassino many times, and I've been to the valley and the observation post where he was mortared and wounded. And the description if you marry his various writings about being wounded and where he was and where he's going to, it's a very accurate description of the terrain.
Yeah.
And it's just an incredibly flat, boring sort of little valley with some flat turf and some goats. But you could see why it was important. And then if you go to the regimental war diaries and then the brigade who were there, you're absolutely right. You can see the terrain straight away. And actually, if you go there, there's gentle dips in the ground, and those are the trenches.
Wow.
And when I was there, I couldn't help but think of him having dug his trench, being on duty there. And he was, he's mortared because he has to go out into the open, climb the hillside and get to an observation post on the top. And he's caught between the two, as are many others. And it was very easy to imagine exactly that particular moment and then translate the whole effect of not just the physical wounding, but the mental wounding as well on top of that. But I've got a question for you, Jane, which is, I mean, we're approaching Remembrance Sunday now, or Remembrance Day. And what was Remembrance Day like in your household if Spike thought of himself as a soldier to the end? Can you remember?
He would observe it. He would observe it on the television, probably from his favourite place, which was his bedroom, where he wrote a lot of his books.
Right.
He had this bedroom with a sort of library around his bed, and I can tell you every book was about a war somewhere. He was pretty war obsessed.
Really?
Yeah. I can't say that he would stand up and observe the national anthem, but he would definitely, that day would be marked. He was a soldier. Like I said, he would often announce himself to people, especially of his age group, as a soldier. He would definitely observe that day, but there wouldn't be a bell.
He didn't join parades, but it was a special day, and it was.
Yes, definitely. Special. Always a sort one. I mean, Spike kept up with his D Battery crew of boys, lads.
That was my next question.
Till the end of his life, until they all passed.
So you've met them all.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The D Battery, the boys in the band. You know, Dad got through the war with many tricks. One of them was music, and his band, the boys in the band were regulars at our house until they passed away. And of course they had reunions every year until they passed, down in Bexhill, where he.
Oh, how lovely!
Oh yeah.
So Jane and perhaps Stewart as well. I mean, you because you've written books, Stewart, with comedy books. Do you reckon Jane Spike had any problems with the editors about putting some of the darker stuff in the books? Because I mean, I'm assuming they were wanting them to be for the laughs, but there are some dark moments. Do you know if you had any kind of battles getting those bits in, or whether just any idea about that at all?
Well, to me, they don't feel edited at all, and I would imagine that that Spike was famous enough at the time that he would have been more or less allowed to do what he wants in those books. Also, I don't really think he's editable, and certainly he seemed to construct his BBC career around the Q shows by doing things that were so baffling to anyone that would edit them. They were not really defied any attempt to organise it. They don't seem edited. They seem that he goes where he wants at whatever point that he likes in a way that it makes sense to him. And I don't think they fit a template. And one of the things that's very enjoyable about them, like in the sketches in the Q series, is the way that each volume is just sort of abandoned at the end. He kind of doesn't really work to any kind of conclusion. He goes, "What will happen in the next book?" Well, you have to. I don't know when I'm going to write it, but if you get it, you'll be able to find out. And they just sort of stop.
Yeah, and they don't start up at the same point. Yeah, they just
make artificial sense of things, which it's just he doesn't try to make artificial sense of things. He allows you to experience things with him. He doesn't attempt to gloss him. There are little bits where that really jump out, and they're all the better for their scarcity. When he's observing children that have been displaced or distressed by the war, and he starts to ask questions about, is it all worth it? And when certain scenes strike him as particularly poignant, there's a bit where they're in a farmhouse that they've occupied in French North Africa, and they befriend a dog that is left there, and then the farmer comes back to find it accidentally shot, and the guy sits up all night with them drinking wine while they're trying to play music on whatever instruments are available. And it's these strange little oases of calm and normality, and that pop out in the middle of them. But even with those, he doesn't do the sort of slightly crass thing of attempting to stitch it all together into some comment about war. He allows you to take away things from it. And certainly I haven't read them for 40 years, and I've read them again this week, and I read them really differently as a 52-year-old man. And I can see exactly what Jane said about him using music to get him through life, which I didn't really relate to when I was young. I wouldn't have really understood what the jazz references were. I think the freedom of that music and of them being able to escape and play together seems to create a space for him where he can shut all the monotony and all the horror out of it. And that really jumps out of it now in a way it didn't when I read them when I was young. I think perhaps because I couldn't conceive of that feeling of despair and of fear. And so I don't think they would have been edited. I don't think an editor would have assembled that book, and they're certainly not ghost written like the majority of most celebrities' books are today.
I mean, the first book is definitely the really funny one, isn't it? I mean, I'm not saying the others aren't, but that's the more conventional. And maybe he did that first one, the publishers, it's going to be a success. And then he went a bit darker in the second one once the first one's a success. Does that make sense?
It follows the logic of the life, though, doesn't it, as well? I mean, the time when they're training on the South Coast is they don't appreciate how bad it's going to be, and there's the camaraderie of all the people, and it's fun going into the town, and silly things happen, and then it's just towards the end it starts to become. I mean, well, there are bits in that. I mean, there's the bit when he's in bed, and you do get these shadows. He's the window in my bed faced north. As I lay there, I could see the glow of the fires. The bombers were still going. He's observing the Blitz miles away in London.
Yeah.
Some must have been on their way back, as we heard cannon fire as night fighters got onto them. What a bloody mess. Men in bombers raining death on defenceless civilians. Still, soon we'd be doing it back to them on a scale never before imagined. For the love of me, I couldn't get the feeling that I was part of this. Killing of civilians was an outrage I couldn't swallow on any basis, on any side. And in the end, there were no sides, just the living and the dead. The next morning, we got confirmation of the raid. I managed to get through to my father. He told me all was well. But it did, and so you'd have this sense of the menace of what is coming down the pipe underneath all the fun of that first section. Certainly got the funniest cover.
Yeah, it's fantastic, isn't it?
It's funny because I noticed that very section there about the bombing. That was one of the things I marked down to mention. So if someone else hadn't mentioned it, I was going to mention that bit because I think that's very poignant. And that would have been in the 1970s. You're quite right, Stuart. That's when we're churning out the films like Where Eagles Dare and all those kind of things. We're admitting that some of the war isn't quite as neat as we like. It is quite unusual. I mean, that's not what writers are doing then. Alistair MacLean never talked in his books about there's people going to die when Clint Eastwood runs down the corridor with his MP40. So that was quite challenging what he did there. I mean, Colin, you're the poet here amongst Stuart's where the language is is very special in Spike's writing, isn't it? I mean, how would you define it?
It's wow. How would you define Spike Milligan's language? It's tailored to the passage he's writing. If you want lovely bits of flow and prose, then read when he goes to Capri with Miss Fontana. But I just think one of the most wonderful phrases that comes, it's from the boredom of setting up a gun battery. So they're in the desert, they've got to put the guns into position, and the phrase he uses to sum that up is the guns were pulled, pushed, and sworn into position. What a wonderful description of putting heavy artillery into position. Because if you read that by any other commentator or writer of World War II, it would be just we heaved and all the physical effort, blah, blah, blah. Spike sums that up in 3 words: pushed, pulled, and most importantly, sworn. Because that's soldiers for you, as Peter, I'm sure, would back us up. There's a wonderful lyricality to the way Spike writes, and the flow and the narrative. It's kind of, if you take volume 1, which I know is not a huge volume, you've read that and you don't even realize you're finished. It just flows by. You don't put it down. You just keep going, and you think, well, where's volume 2? Which in my case was at your house, Woody.
It was, yeah.
But they do flow so beautifully. And to take it to a different thing, because I think my eldest daughter is actually watching at the moment, Paul, so if I can give her a name check. So, hi, Alice, miss you loads. Reading to her when she was little, Spike has this wonderful ability to communicate with people of all ages. That's the beauty of his writing. And there's the wonderful alphabet poem that he wrote. And I remember reading that to all my children when they were kids, and they would just giggle. Just really uncontrollable giggling. Because when Spike wants you to do that, he can make you do that. When he wants you to reflect, he can make you reflect. That is the beauty of the way he uses this language. And I thought Stewart summed it up beautifully when he said, these books are uneditable. Nobody could edit Spike, because that's the flow. The stream of consciousness, which is backed up with his regimental diaries, which he does say he uses, the letters he got from his commanding officers at various stages. And of course, all the men he must have sat down with and talked to make this all flow into one. And it's just 7 absolutely wonderfully written books.
But they do, I mean, with the darker side, they do use some terminology that we wouldn't use today. There's lots of army humor there, lots of swearing. I mean, I was surprised how often the C word comes in. I'm going to read a quote later, and it does have the C word in it. And I was surprised. I didn't remember reading that. I don't remember that my first reading, like Stewart 40 years ago. I don't remember that. But now maybe it's because we're attuned to noticing things that might be offensive. I don't know.
I think you do remember it, Paul. I think you're just blotting it out. I think you were talking to your mates using about that passage or passages that use that word in the schoolyard.
My granddad, who was Royal Artillery on heavy guns, although he was searchlights, he threw me Spike's first book and said that's what it was like when I was about 9 or something. And I read it and I just laughed. And then later on he said, but did you see the darker bits? And I go, well, not really, Granddad, because I was like 9. But then he kind of sat with me and said, yeah, but there are some darker bits there. And the Blitz. I mean, my grand never went overseas, so he didn't have the experience of actually seeing the death and devastation Spike did. But I mean, Jane, I mean, we're talking about your father's writing, 20 years nearly after he passed away. I mean, are you pleased that his books are being taken seriously by the military field as well as just people having a good old laugh at them? Because that must be quite gratifying to you.
I'm a little bit mind blown by everything I'm listening to tonight by some very learned and knowledgeable human beings here. So I'm rethinking everything. Not that I ever underestimate my dad, but yes, it's a bit humbling. This it really is. Well,
we're pleased to bring that in, but I mean,
Thank you.
I mean, but his books are regarded by military historians as well as just the general public. And I mean, Peter, that you backed that up earlier. I mean, they are good, solid accounts of the war that happen to make you laugh. But does that mean, Peter, that they might be not considered as serious works about the war because we just remember the laughs? I mean, I don't think they're going to appear in any reading lists at Sandhurst or West Point, are they? But maybe they should. I mean, perhaps they should be listed there.
Oh, I think they probably are. I mean, it strikes me just listening to our conversation that what Spike did was he turns the whole idea of a military memoir on its head, because soldiers tend to write about the wars and the battles and the attacks and the dramatic bits and pieces. And Spike's memoirs reflect the real business of soldiering. And the real business of soldiering is that for 95% of the time, you are hanging around. You're not going over the top or engaging in any kind of proactive shooting war. And it's all about how you manage that time and you stay fit and you stay alert. And that's where the humor comes out. That's where the absurd situations develop. And that's what his writing's about. There's very little shooting that comes out of that. It's implicit. And Stewart, you sort of mentioned that several times. You know, the death is there implicitly. It's very, there's very little explicitly referred to. But it's all about what soldiers are doing the rest of the time. And in fact, that's what military life is all about.
But they're different.
It's not, running around with a bayonet or shooting a gun. It's the friendships you develop. And so much of the book, this is why I think he's bottled something that very few other writers have managed to do. So, we might turn to other memoirs that are well known to everyone, someone like Sidney Jari. He's writing from an officer's point of view, although he's not got an officer's background necessarily, we might say. But people read him because they want to understand about leadership and going over the top and engaging the enemy in the Second World War. And this, Spike's 7 books aren't that, but they're so much better because they're not, because it gives you the other side of the story that we tend to sort of overlook. And George MacDonald Fraser, Quartered Safe Out Here, different theatre, that's dealing with Burma, very much the same. There's very little shooting war in there, and the opening chapter, for those of you who haven't read it, is absolutely brilliant. It's about going out on his first ever patrol and various things happen, but he's always at the butt of everybody else's humour, and when things go wrong, it's his fault. And this has nothing to do with sort of combat, as it were. It's the way the youngest individual in Donald's case, MacDonald Fraser's case, is the butt of everybody else's jokes, humours, complaints, and everything else. And that's how you mature as a person. And the books are all about Spike maturing as an individual, gathering his friends. And Jane, you were talking about all these friends that he never ever lets go. You see how deep those friendships are. And they're made in a military network, but he has those for the rest of his life.
Oh, and
you're creating this. It's obviously a turning point in his life, as it is for so many people. But you're also developing these friendships you're going to keep for the next 60 years. I mean, that's so important. More than 60 years.
Yeah.
I mean,
this is what we get in the text all the time.
The thing about I might to jump in. He has the friendships with people who obviously he knew, he got to know, they endured after war. I think in many ways more poignant are the people who he meets just once. The random people. Sometimes he doesn't even remember their name. I wonder whether he's using fake names. And you wonder now, if he was living today, he'd be able to research some of these people perhaps a bit better with Google and look into archives. But to me, it's those encounters with people who he had no idea who they were. He never saw them again. The encounter I'm particularly talking about is when he's in hospital. I'll read my little quote, then I'll bring it over to Jane again. And this is when he's been in hospital in Italy, and he's talking about he's waiting to be returned to unit, RTU'd. And I'll read it. So this is from Mussolini, he's part in my downfall. We walk along the line of muddy tents. I find an empty one. I see men walking rapidly with empty mess tins. Food, I follow. We arrive at the field kitchen. Food, 2 slices of cold bully beef, a carrot, a boiled potato, a mug of tea, 2 biscuits. No mess tent, eat where you stand. I see an intelligent face. His shoulder flashes, Hamps, that's 2nd, 4th Hampshires. We get talking. Name Arrowsmith. Was on the landings, shell shock. He looks like Ronald Coleman, slim, about 5'7", intelligent, sensitive. Then he quotes the guy. It's simple arithmetic. The longer you are alive in action, the nearer you are to getting your lot. You see, I think, I rationalize, and that way you see only too clearly your death approaching. If I go back to my mob, I'll never see Blighty again. I came ashore with B Company. At the end of the 3 days, me, the sergeant, and one private were left. We were given replacements. 2 days later, me and 2 of the new replacements are all that's left. I mean, it's on the cards. One night, we are on patrol. We brush with a jury patrol. A grenade explodes on a tree next to my head. I don't remember anymore until I wake up in an ambulance. The quack says it's concussion and I'll soon be all right. All right? The cunt. He's talking about the outside. What about up here? He taps his head with his spoon. It sounded hard-boiled. That's where it all happens. And inside it says no go. And now to me, that was when he's encountered someone who's clearly struggling from shell shock or PTSD, whatever you want to call it. And I wonder whether Arrowsmith was his name, whether that's a name he invented for it. But it's those people that came into his life for a very short length of time that obviously had a huge impact on him. And that we were going to bring up his acceptance and understanding that men in combat struggle, because that's what I think is unique about Spike's writing, is that there's not much heroics in it. It's all about what happens to these men. And I think he's got to be about one of the first writers to really admit, you know what, war breaks people. It breaks the best people. It breaks the most heroic man can be a hero 1 minute running across a field, knock out machine gun. The next day he's a broken man. And Spike was very, very new to bring that kind of stuff up. So I mean, Jane, you know, you grew up growing up with your father. Clearly his mental health that was something that was always a part of him. You've said how Peter asked about Remembrance Day, and do you think he ever got over the World War II? Did he want to get over World War II? What did it mean to him? I mean, give us some idea.
Well, I as his child observed a man who became depressed because he was damaged in World War II. And a lot of people thought of Spike as a mad bloke, but in fact, he was a damaged soldier. And I'm speaking from the point of view being his daughter and observing his depressions. They often were, although he was sensitive, we all know that. He was a very sensitive man. You can see that by the way he writes and the color of his words. But when he was a broken person, he would often hallucinate about war. He would often, the depression would be based around the being broken by the war. And he'd even, I remember one time he was very, very down and he was on sleeping tablets and he was having a nightmare about a battle at Ypres where he had lost his horse. Now we're talking, now he was there, now in another, he was having a sort of battle that he wasn't even involved in. He was crying, speaking in French, and devastated that his horse was killed. Now, this is how deeply invested in the wars he was in general. He didn't just go through World War II. He studied all wars, and he was fascinated by it. But as I said, he was not highly educated in a university, but he was self-educated. He came from a military background that went back 3 or 4 generations, maybe more. He was raised around military. It was probably in all of his world. He was, he was the child of a soldier and the grandchild of a soldier. He was an Irishman. He didn't have ideas above his station, but he had this incredible imagination, which probably got him through it. And also, as I said, when he went into a downer about things, often he'd be fretting about things he had not been involved in, but he felt as a soldier what it would have been like to be involved in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, 3 things about that to me. First of all, although he did have that knowledge, and you can see it because he occasionally drops in references to studies he's read of wars from from classical history as he's travelling through the landscapes where those happen. But he didn't attempt to do what other kinds of war books do, which was to provide any overarching analysis of why the war was happening or of the strategies behind it. And that's what makes them different to books like Stalingrad or Berlin or whatever. They're a person's ground eye view of it. And that's why they're unique and so different to all those more academic books. The same thing that I found myself noticing this time around was I started thinking about the books in terms of sound. And here's basically a musician that is put into here's a musician who's sensitive to sound and to tonality and to rhythm, who's put into an environment where those things are disrupted. One of the things he doesn't like about the gun attacks on one of the camps he's in the second book is that it's arrhythmical, and he thinks they're doing it on purpose to be extra annoying because they keep being bursts of sound that don't follow a pattern. And certainly he, like Larkin, I imagine he would have, although he loved jazz, I imagine he would have struggled with the John Coltrane advances of the 60s that abandoned rhythm or tonality. It wasn't the sort of thing he would have coped with. And secondly, I started also, there are long periods where he's made to work incredibly long shifts on the wireless when he's not slept for days. Yes. And I should imagine that the sound of that, if you're a person who's used to musicality, was fairly traumatic. Then I started to think about how the Goons, which was always a stretch for me as a teenager, because I think the references to it was so to do with that generation that it was you would get lost. But I started to appreciate it more as abstract art as I get older. But it is very much about the tonality of sound. He worked very closely with the radiophonic workshop in the later series to achieve sounds that weren't available, you couldn't generate in real time, and it seems to be on some level the Goons a sort of panic response to sound, and there's so much disruption in it, and noise, and panic, and a lot of the funniest things about the TV series to me are where music is interrupted by noise, like the Valkyrie that blows raspberries and whatever. And I do wonder whether I don't have the medical or the expert in acoustic background, and I'll never be able to talk to him about it. But it does seem like there is a legacy of bombardment in the comedy of linguistic and acoustic disruption, and certainly the way he responds to those things in the stories. That seems to be one of the things that really gets him, is just the noise, the unpredictability of it, and the way that it doesn't follow patterns, and it's all tied in with shock.
He's very sensitive to noise for his entire life. In fact, we had to move house once because of noise. He moved from his house in Barnet. I'd left home by then because he could hear the M25. It had just been built, and he had his bedroom treble glazed. But I think he was haunted by guns and bombs for all of his life. And as I was saying earlier, the damage that he sustained during World War II led to him being affected by depression for his whole life. But sound, very, very interesting points about the sound. Yeah, there were incredible military sounds throughout the whole of the Goon shows, weren't there? But he was also very precise about what he wanted, or it had to be accurate.
Yeah.
Again, his discipline side, and he tortured the BBC till it was right.
Well, I was listening to a thing with Dick Mills from the Radiophonic Workshop on Radio 4 Extra recently, where he talked about the very precise instructions he would be given by the Goon scripts to achieve these very surreal sounds, and then would found that if he followed them, he could understand exactly what was required and what was meant. And I think it was Dennis Norden that said about Spike that he knew exactly how long it was too long to go with a thing, or how long to take it until it had gone on too long. And I think that is a jazz musician's feel. It is a level for where you stop the solo and return to the main theme.
And knowing when something's funny and when it's not funny, when an explosion for that type of thing was right, whether
Yeah.
it was accurate, and the correct gun and the correct sound and tonality and all that. Yeah.
But also his World War II experiences, being on the radio listening when people's lives are depending on you transcribing coordinates correctly, getting information across, because if you get it wrong, if a message goes wrong, people could die. So I think even his role as a signaler is going to make him even more dependent on the accuracy of sound, because that's what he's doing. He's passing forward observers. Peter could back us up. Anything to do with observation was an incredibly dangerous job in World War II, and incredibly vital. In Normandy, the cemeteries here are full of young men, officers who are forward observers, who are out there observing, and their job is to be listening and sending information. It has to be absolutely perfect. It has to be efficient. It has to be as quick as it possibly can be, because the enemy could be listening. So that's going to have an effect on his ear as well. That precision of getting, if you get things wrong, people die. Of course,
I mean, this is why I love discussions like this, because you pick up new things, and this is a great vehicle for me to when I reread the war diaries, his war memoirs. I'll look for sounds now, because before it was the shape. I'm a wordsmith, and I Spike's wordsmithery is right up there as the gold standard for many people who write. And I look at his works along the lines of a sort of Siegfried Sassoon. He's that kind of wide-ranging wordsmith, and Sassoon writes poetry as well as prose, and so does Spike. And he has his different volumes of the First World War. Jane, how familiar were you with your father's library, or do you still have it? Does he have Siegfried Sassoon and the First World War bits and pieces in there?
Bit of a sore point. A lot of my father's belongings were, it's very difficult, but my stepmother got rid of a lot of things maybe shouldn't have done, including the war diaries.
Right.
So and that was heartbreaking. But and so I'm sorry I can't answer your question. I just remember just how much I loved being in his bedroom, and he recreated it in every house he was in, and his library was always military precision. Mesopotamia over here and Romans here and medieval wars here, but everything was very specific. Boer War, because his grandfather fought in the Boer War. So he was very precise about his books, but I'm sorry I can't tell you.
No. I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, you've already told me that there's so much more military history layered on him and his writing and his background than I realized. I knew about the family background in the military, but I didn't realize he had this huge library of it gave him a much deeper understanding.
But I think all of us who buy military books,
I mean, there is a sense of what I would call the shadow of the song, that a lot we forget about it now, but that hung over the second generation, because the First World War was over, it only finished just a little over 20 years before, and so there's this great anxiety that it's going to be a rerun of that with the same sort of casualties. But that's absolutely fascinating. So sound, I mean, of course, he's been put in a very kind of military unit from the point of view of sound, because he's a gunner, and gunners are all about making loud noises all the time, and not necessarily sort of in any kind of organized manner, and layer onto that big noise from heavy guns, and he's a signaler. So he's really drawn the short straw in terms of actually what he needs, which is either organized music of military noise, which he doesn't get, and the horrible loud bangs from heavy guns as well, not field artillery. And then on top of that, he's a signaler, so he's got to listen to the hiss and crackle of communications all the time.
I mean, I just wanted to bring about the buying of military books, because I mean, I've got a massive archive of books like you have, Peter, and Colin has as well. I wonder with Spike, the thing is about buying military books, you'll find out more information about a particular battle, what a particular tactic was used, a particular general, why he did this. You'll never find out from books why we go to war. That's the eternal question. We will never, ever understand why we do it. So he clearly read about the battles, but do you think, Jane, he was on some quest to find out why do men do this? I mean, a quest will never get satisfied, but was that part of it, do you think?
Well, yeah, like you say, I don't think he'd be silly enough to say why, but he would certainly question it. And often, you know, his more poetic leanings, that those thoughts would go into poetry rather than his books, these books. But there's plenty of his questioning in his serious poetry. And yes, I mean, as his kid, I did ask him once if he would consider lecturing on why we shouldn't have war, you know, when I was a teenager, because I felt like this man knew the ins and outs of why we shouldn't have war. It felt like he'd explored all aspects of it, and he could describe the pain of it perfectly. If there was anyone for the job, I thought it was him. But he just happened to be my dad, because he was the living, breathing version of why you shouldn't have war. How can you damage someone as beautiful as that? You know, that was my dad, I'm saying, because when I did read about in detail how he was blown up, of course, it was heartbreaking for me. You know, he was young, he was bleeding already. Do you remember these terrible hemorrhoids? And he's climbing up this hill. He'd been awake for days. God knows how he managed to carry his trumpet throughout all this chaos as well. I love that.
You mentioning the hemorrhoids is really one of the great, you know, I mean, that really sums these books up, that they move from hemorrhoids to mortar shelling. They move from tiny, sort of stupid, annoying, everyday things to these massive incidents. And
from that to death.
You don't get that in the more conventional histories, and that they really humanize the whole story, absolutely brilliant, and they're really funny. I mean, there's a lot of stuff about problems with their
real life, isn't it? You know,
a lot of genital manipulation in the books, isn't there? A lot of farting as well. I'd forgotten. My 10-year-old me remembers that. But when he changes subject on the same page and he goes from the awful tragedy to something funny and then back to tragedy, it never feels, when you're reading it, jarring, though, does it? It seems to
it's absolutely seamless.
Yeah, I mean, that's a testament to his writing, isn't it? Again, Colin, how it doesn't ever feel awkward.
That never does. It just flows. And to go back to farting, Paul, there's a lovely passage. I think it's in the very last one, when he says somebody is coughing down in the breakfast room, and he says, "Of course, I let my cough out in the morning, and as a gentleman, I slipped them out in my room, and then I opened the window and shared them with the rest of Hamburg." And just that is fun. It's just incredible. I think I'm pretty certain it's the very last one of the 7 volumes. I think it's piecework.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's absolute seamless, the way it just flows. And it is that way. That's what makes them so enjoyable to read. It is that flow. And yes, you stop for a moment because you've got to pay for the laughs, as I said earlier. When you get hit with the dark part, but it's always very short, and then immediately you're back laughing again. You paid your debt. Here's the next line. And that's the beauty of the books, is that you could read them aged, as you did, Paul, age 10. I'm slightly older. Or you can read them when you're my age now, 56. It's just, you take different things, as Stewart said much earlier. You take different things. You notice different things in them that you miss, depending on your age and how often you read them. But it just seamlessly flows together. And you miss a lot because you laugh so loud.
But my last question, because we're going to bring it to an end in a few minutes, but my last question, though, is we are all not teenagers now on this show, where none of us are, young. Will those books still have the same resonance for people in their 20s? Because, I mean, when we're talking about things like Python is still universally loved, isn't it? Everyone still loves Holy Grail and Life of Brian. But Q and some of the Spike stuff, it's not kind of being picked up by the 20-somethings. Should it be picked up? But his writing is what I'm right about. Will the younger people, Stewart, I mean, what's your feeling on that?
One of the reasons that Spike's television stuff won't be picked up by younger generations is because, like a lot of great stuff, it was mainly lost by the BBC. So it exists in fragments and not in the form that it was intended to be viewed. The other thing about Spike's television stuff from the 60s and 70s is that he was trying to deal in things like curry and chips or whatever, with the implications of multiculturalism, and he was trying to look at it from the point of view of an immigrant, and he saw himself as an outsider because he was Irish, and I don't doubt
And
that
born in India.
Yeah, and he was born in India.
And fluent Hindi speaker.
And his intentions, and Johnny Spate's intentions, who worked with him on those, I think were honourable. But I think that it would be hard for young people today to decode those and some of the similar things in the TV series. They'd have to get back into the mindset of the time. The war books, I think, weirdly, because they deal with an earlier time, they're not complicated by that period, and they absolutely stand alone. And I think that the compassion for people, and like when he talks about the cruel treatment of the North Africans by the French colonialists, and how he can't understand how anyone could be like that to other people, would those little things jump out that would be incredibly to what people pejoratively call the woke generation, and I think people would really relate to it. And there's a lot of anxieties about war and pacifism in them. I think for the humour, I think people can. I think that young people would have to take a little bit of a step back and understand that when he's talking about the jazz, that's as he says that it was regarded by his superior officers in the 40s rather in the way that cannabis was in the 70s as a dangerous outsider art. And it's difficult for young people today to believe that a Bing Crosby song was ever considered subversive or dangerous. But if you can think back to the fact that he was actually at the cutting edge of a forbidden art form that was banned by the Nazis and banned by Mussolini, and so actually he's quite a radical figure for that time, a radical autodidact musician with so I think people can really relate to it, and I think that they would relate to it a little bit more if they understand the context of the time. The problem you have with Spike is that his much of his work has been lost just unbelievably now. I mean, it just seems incredible to us now how much of this stuff has gone missing, and also that some of it does require a little bit of historical contextualization, but more the stuff from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I think, than his writings in the 70s about the 40s.
Yeah,
I mean, he would have seen himself as a rebel and an outsider, and the odd thing is he then becomes the national treasure and part of the mainstream. I mean, we grew up on his humor, but that fed into Monty Python, that fed into Not the 9 O'Clock News, that fed into a lot of today's sort of comedians, and so you can see the sort of thread. But it was incredibly radical and groundbreaking for the time. But I think of everything, probably the war memoirs are the ones that will last, because you can pin them down to a particular piece of time. If you have any problems with any of his comments, you can, that's a reflection of what war does. It screws people up, and you get some sort of very odd reflections. So I think Spike's war memoirs, all 7 volumes, are not only good and objective and serious history, and he probably wouldn't want to be seen like that, but they will last as well. And if people want a flavour of what the Second World War was like, those are some of those will be the kinds of books that other generations will be urged to go back to. I don't think they've dated, because part of his genius is of course he's writing for people of all ages. So these aren't grown-up books. I mean, how many of us have already said we read them when we were young teenagers?
Yeah, exactly.
And even his children's books, you can see that he's writing for adults and vice versa. So I think people of every age get something out of them. And as we've already said tonight, I'm going to reread them and look now for the music and all those references layered on top, which I would have missed, because last time I read them, I was looking for military references. I was writing the history of the Casino campaign. And before then, I was reading them when they came out and reading them very much for the humour. So you've got all these different layers. And I think that's why Spike Milligan will endure because he had this genius with words and concepts and themes and sounds. And how many other writers you could ever say that about? That's the genius, and that's why he'll last for me anyway.
Well, it comes back to what we said earlier about the fact they appeal to military historians, just people wanting a jolly good laugh. They're a social history. They examine how we looked at things in the 50s, 60s, 70s. They've got so many themes going on. They are just universally appealing. So, I mean, Jane, I'm keeping an eye on the comments coming on YouTube, and people are grateful for you sharing what you have done about your father and Stewart's comments as well. But I mean, what would Spike make of us having a discussion analyzing his work? Did he like people kind of examining his comedy, or did he find that awkward? Was he, because Stewart, you famously deconstruct your own routines when you're on stage, so you examine your work. But did Spike like criticism like that? How would he have felt about this, Jane?
Well, he was very self-deprecating, I think, really, and that kept him he was quite humble. He did obviously have an ego, but he was, like he said, I'm just a soldier, or I'm just a clown. When he did all this incredible writing, his drive was what really was his thing. But yeah, he'd probably call us, "You fools!"
Yeah. Fools, yeah.
He'd do that, wouldn't he? You're a
yeah. And I think he seems like someone to me who is very keen to talk enthusiastically about people whose work he admired. And all through those books, he's dropping the names of writers and musicians he admired. But I remember in the mid-90s when they did try to reissue the tiny fragments of his work that had survived from the television, he was extremely resistant to analysing it. He didn't like to be drawn on it, and whenever he was presented with sort of lifetime achievement awards at ceremonies and stuff like that, he wanted to get through it as quickly as possible. And I think
brilliantly pissed off.
Yeah, he would have been, exactly, and he would have been very ill-equipped to deal with the modern world of comedy, where people basically have to market themselves as personalities, and the work is the work's not really allowed to speak for itself. The Twitter account has to speak for itself, and the Facebook account and the Instagram have to speak for themselves. And I think he would have, again, I don't know him, but it feels to me like he was a person for whom the work was what communicated, not him as a personality.
I mean, my God, I was saying to someone today how brilliant it would be if he was alive now in this situation that we find ourselves in. What he would say, just his energy was quite incredible. But the loss of some of the TV stuff, I think he'd swallow that. He'd just write new stuff, and I think the best of him is still here. We're very, very privileged. I mean, my sisters and I took over the running of his company last year, and now we're privy to material and information and stuff we haven't seen. And one of the first things that we were requested was, would we give permission for a reprint of Adolf Hitler, My Partner's Downfall? Last June, Hatchards wanted to reprint it, and we were like, well, yeah, great. And we want to do them all every year. And then we looked at the figures and we thought, my God, this stuff is still earning money. It's still popular. It may not have been presented as well as I think this sort of stuff would be handy for some students studying World War II history.
Totally, absolutely. Oh, I'm so pleased. I'm so pleased.
I absolutely loved as a kid, which was the box set.
And those first covers that the Penguin brought out were absolute classics.
Yeah, and they're his drawings. Again, multidisciplinary artist, musician, painter, poet, writer. This is why his books are so fascinating, because he sees it from all these perspectives. Lover as well, obviously, the whole bit. I think that he's just the fact he's my dad is something else, but my God, they're so observant. His powers of observation are off the charts, and his ability.
I'm very pleased, Jane, to hear that you're in charge of the archive now. Well, because
and about
like often the things just seem to sort of disappear or get ill-treated or not really looked after. So I'm really pleased to hear that. And
fresh energy in the camp now. Fresh energy, guys.
Yeah, great.
Well, I think with what Jane said there, I think we'll bring this show to a close, because we'll end up repeating ourselves. I mean, it's been extraordinary listening to Jane, particularly, and Peters and Colin and Stewart, your insight. It's been I mean, for those watching, I mean, if you there are a couple of Americans, because I don't think Spike has quite traveled across the Atlantic in the same way we revere him in England. Some people saying they're going to go and buy his book, so that's great. So, I mean, for those who haven't read them, why haven't you read them? But I mean, they do stand the test of time. And I think, you know, in amongst reading Peter's books and James Holland and John McManus, to just read a bit of Spike for a bit of balance. That war was lots of waiting around, lots of hurry up and wait, lots of just playing with their genitals in the barrack room. There was a lot of that, and I think that is important as well. So thanks very much, Colin, Peter, Stuart, James. It's been fantastic. It's been really good.
Everyone, thank you.
Lovely to meet you all.
Thank you.
And
Lovely. Absolutely.
We've got our Spy Films of World War II show tomorrow evening, and if anyone's watching this wants to check out our Patreon page to help out for tour guide, and all that'd be very much appreciated. I've got to say happy birthday tomorrow to Willie Robertson, who is one of the viewers of the show, whose wife said, "Oh, we should give him a name check." So I did that, so I'm done. So that was extraordinary. So I think we can safely say that Spike Milligan is a great writer of World War II, and we've accomplished that tonight. So thank you very much, everybody. I'll end the stream, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you very much.
What are we going to do now?
What are we going to do now?
Thank you.